Daniel Powell teaches a variety of writing courses at Florida State College at Jacksonville. He enjoys reading and writing stories across a broad spectrum of genres, but he has an affinity for horror, science fiction, and fantasy. He lives with his wife and children near the Timucuan Preserve, where you can frequently find him jogging those haunted trails. And Daniel will be joined in conversation today with local author and local professor Tim Gilmore. So Tim is the author of 21 books and several works for the stage, and is the founder of the literary arts festival Jacks by Jacks. He is also the writer and creator of Jack Psychogeo, a project that explores nearly 600 stories of strange and historic locations in and around Jacksonville, Florida. So Tim, I'll leave the rest to you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. This on? Yeah. Well, I'm excited to chat with my colleague Dan today. I feel like whenever we do cross paths, it's always great. We've done presentations together before, but that hasn't happened as often as I'd like. So I look forward to finding out a little bit about your writing life today. I want to ask some specifics about the kinds of things you write and also your techniques, but I'm always very interested to find out how people first got into writing. How did that happen for you?
So my dad had an old Royal typewriter that he used to type his college papers on when he went to Utah, and he gave that to me when I was young. My parents, the best gift they ever gave me, and a debt I can't repay, is them really nourishing reading in the home. We had a single income, and we didn't always have the nicest technology, but they would go to the library and they would buy bags of books at the annual sale, and just having the option of reading Tolkien and reading C.S. Lewis when I was a kid really inspired me to do my own writing on my dad's typewriter. So we still have it, and it's in a box somewhere. There's one repair shop in Seattle, Washington, that still repairs typewriters that I know of. But they encouraged me. My parents did from an early age to write the Palpio menus when we got an Apple II GS, and I started writing short stories. The adult side of things is I was an adjunct, a road warrior. So if you work in higher education, you're going around to a lot of different colleges. And I really didn't have time to do a lot of writing for myself. When I came here in 2005, I put my head down and worked really hard to do the work of the college. And then in '07, I started to send out submissions. And in '07, it was still over the transom as the publishing word. So you would have to actually they call it the slush pile, and you'd send out a manuscript and with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and you'd wait for a response. And sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't. But everything is migrated now. Even the prestige magazines are all digital in terms of their submission process. Between '07 and 2011 is kind of where I found my writing voice. Took me that long to really click in and feel like I was making headway. And I think that's an important lesson is you do have to learn through the process of rejection. And the closer that you get to those acceptances, and the more they write, hey, this was close, made the final round of consideration, that's how you click in and you hone your voice and your craft. But yeah, in and around 2011, I started to have good success. And I mean, it's just a story like anything else where it takes practice.
So when I think about your writing, I think of it actually in a number of different ways. But I think of some of your writing as Lovecraftian, and certainly horror. But also there's some post-apocalyptic stuff in there, I think. And your most recent novel, right, Down in the Sawgrass Boneyard, takes some really surprising turns, which almost make it read like different kinds of novels at different times. I'm curious as to, what you're most drawn to writing and why.
Great question. And I am a fan of Stephen King. I do read widely, and I do teach the classics at the college. But in terms of the contemporary authors, I'm a big fan of quiet, mundane horror. I like stories where there's an insider-outsider kind of aesthetic going on. There's a show that you can watch. It's a limited series on HBO. It's about 5 years old. It's got Jude Law in it. It's called The Third Day. It didn't get a ton of traction, but it is very, very creepy. It's only 6 episodes, but the first three are summer, and then the last three are winter. And it features this tiny island, Osea Island in the United Kingdom. It's one of those places that you have to get to on a causeway that's tidal. So when the tide's down, you can get out there. And a man gets stuck out there on this island, and he's from the mainland. I like those kinds of stories where there's an insider-outsider dynamic, like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. That's the classic story of feeling alienated and ostracized. And so that quiet, mundane horror informs my taste on a lot of the things I like to write. I do love the Lovecraftian mythos. And so Lovecraft's, you guys are very welcome to say that. The Lovecraftian work, if you read H.P. Lovecraft, he is a conflicted character, not unlike Jack London, in the sense that you have to divorce his creative output from some of the views he held in his life. I mean, he was definitely one of these writers who, in retrospect, created a lot of controversy. But I devoured everything that H.P. Lovecraft ever wrote, and that sense that there's something else out there, that cosmic. There was a German psychiatrist, Ernst Jentsch, who created this idea of the uncanny, and that was picked up by Sigmund Freud as a concept. And uncanny, or unheimlich, just means basically feeling ostracized and alienated, not homely, not comfortable. And much of what Lovecraft produced, inspires that undercurrent of dread. It's the slow build, toward the monstrous payoff. So, but I'm happy in the sense that when I do tackle a new project, I'm really not looking for that. I'm not the writer who's going to write, 6 items in a series. I know that's popular to leave folks on a cliffhanger. I like to write standalone projects that take on different voices and different approaches. But that quiet, mundane horror of Stephen King's Nightmares and Dreamscapes, that's kind of like my sweet spot. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, quiet, mundane horror. That's a great phrase. It's, it seems to me at least to be kind of the opposite of the cheap jump scare kind of, approach. And we could probably talk about Lovecraft for a whole hour. I know there's a Lovecraft film festival in Portland, right? Where you're from, Portland, Oregon.
Yes.
There's so much that would be interesting to talk about with him. You mentioned Shirley Jackson. He's one of my favorite writers, as a matter of fact. And I'm curious, you're having moved from Oregon to Florida. That's a huge shift in lots of different ways, certainly culturally. I wasn't thinking about asking you this, but have you gotten into Southern Gothic much? I don't know. What do you have any? But I love Flannery O'Connor and Southern Gothic stuff. So if not, we can just go on to the next.
No,
one. But I'm just curious.
No, 100%. And so when we were looking at places to relocate in higher education, there's jobs primarily in California, Pennsylvania, New York, Texas, and Florida. And I was devouring the Florida tradition of literary writers. Last year, I reread in order all of the Travis McGee novels by John D. MacDonald. What a wordsmith, right? Like, that guy could create ambiance and set the scene, and he said so much in so few words. I mean, he's almost like he's got a lot of Hemingway in his prose style. James Lee Burke's the same way, but it was Carl Hiaasen, it was Randy Wayne White, it was Tim Dorsey, who's been here to the library and into Jacksonville many, many times. The Florida tradition of writers is really what drew me to really peppering the peninsula with applications. And we had opportunities to move over in the Gulf side. Punta Gorda was our first job offer, and it got creamed by a hurricane. And they got rid of that job, froze hiring. But Jacksonville is an up-and-coming city, and I still feel that way 20 years later. And I see some of the things in our city that are exciting, some of the developments. I see just a steady stream of students who are doing great work at the college, which is always invigorating for me. And so the Fleming O'Connors, certainly the writers in the Southern tradition. I think I have Deliverance open on my desk right now at the office. I just came from Deerwood. That definitely informed our choice to move here.
Interesting. I want to ask you about Oregon to Florida. Portland is such a distinct town, right? And it's got its own distinct culture, distinct literary tradition, everything else. What was it like transitioning and in down Sawgrass Boneyard? You actually write a good bit of kind of what you might call the real Florida, outside the air conditioning, outside the suburbs, out, into, some pretty brutal ecosystems, right? I guess culturally and otherwise, can you talk about the difference from Oregon to Florida and what that's been like for you?
Absolutely. And Jacksonville's now home. It's definitely our adopted hometown. And I'm an optimist. I wake up with a pretty good glass of half cold water. It's the way I see life. So I do embrace relationships and meeting new people. And so we came to Jacksonville with that attitude, and it's become a great place for us. Now we miss all of our friends and family in Oregon, and they are politically and geographically, obviously, the climate's very different. In Oregon, if you live in Portland, there'd be days where the streetlights wouldn't go off. It would just be a steady rain all day long and a nice cup of coffee. But there were also days or years where you might only have 100 days of sunlight, sustained sunshine. Seasonal affective disorder is real. I didn't know an alternative. I didn't know that there were places like Florida to compare that to. We love getting out. We used to buy the state parks pass every year, and we switched over to a zoo pass because we got young kids. But we pay that state parks pass off by July, using it so much to get into state parks. And that's still the way we recreate. But when we went to the Everglades, I was just transfixed. My family took a couple of vacations down to the Everglades. This was 2019, our last one, and that's when COVID hit. It was March 19th or March 9th, I think. It was somewhere in the middle of March when everything got crazy, and they canceled our hotel room in Tampa. And we're driving home in my wife's CRV, and on NPR they kind of whisper, and it was just creepy. It felt like we were in some kind of a post-apocalyptic film, because we're driving home and they're talking about this closed today, and hearing it in NPR. And it was surreal. But I will say that week we spent down there, the Everglades has such a conflicted history. If you ever want to fall down the rabbit hole, just Google Golden Gate Estates. It was the Florida land swap that took place down there, where they were flying people in and selling them lots that were never going to be developed. And they developed infrastructure. The strange thing that happened this week is when they're talking about alligator Alcatraz, they're putting those temporary units in an old runway. There's all kinds of crazy infrastructure in the middle of the Everglades that never got built out. And then there's strange little communities down there. There's obviously the history of the native indigenous people who live down there. It's a place that has a lot of solemnity to it. If you spend time down there in the Everglades, especially on your own, you'll feel that natural ambiance.
Did you do that while you were working on this book? Before did you guys go down to the Everglades just because you hadn't done it before you were in Florida, or were you actually kind of researching what you were going to be writing about?
I was not, but I internalized it. The way this book started, I was on a text thread with my friends from Oregon, and this was right after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the Parkland shooting took place. 17 kids and teachers were killed. And on the text thread, I said, I would like to write a novel about leading the head of the NRA into the Everglades and leaving him to his own devices and see what happens, right? And everybody wrote back, I'll read that. So I was like, shoot, maybe I should start working on this. And then that spilled into, we didn't do the trip for that, but the trip informed much of the writing there.
I want to ask you some about your writing process. I'm interested in how writers work. And I know some people who map things out completely ahead of time. They're totally different from the way my brain works. But they plan extensively. They know the end, and how they're going to work toward it. And I know some people who just decide to let the process take them where it's going to take them. Where are you in that spectrum?
Probably a little bit of both. I like the grip it and rip it approach. A lot of times you'll have a moment of inspiration and you just don't know where it comes from. It's a lightning bolt that comes out of nowhere. I was exercising at the Y once and a sentence popped into my head and I couldn't even finish my workout. I had to go home and hit the word processor. I keep a journal next to my bed, so when I wake up with strange dreams, write those things down. I've got one in my truck as well, so if I'm jogging those Timucuan trails, I can cut it short and go write down the ideas. And that's where a lot of my inspiration comes from, is exercising in the woods. I really like to spend time turning my radio off and listening. But I'm pretty formulaic when it comes to in the spring when I'm off. At the college, they hired me on a fall-summer schedule, so I'm off from early December through May. And I'm pretty formulaic at that point, and I'm trying to get it to the computer at specified times and do specified page counts. Because I do feel like there's a lot of value in the tangible side of things. I do write stuff out, and all those notes just go into a pile and they end up somewhere else. So in my office right now, I've got a whole bunch of file folders for different projects I've worked on. When it comes to the short fiction, I like to write what I'm reading, and I like to be topical when it comes to seeing stuff on the news. How can we put a twist on that and make it uncanny? But yeah, for the most part, it's a little bit of both. There's some planning at the front end, but then once you grab the narrative thread, and if you guys write it at home, you'll know this. Once you grab that narrative thread, you just follow it.
With this book, actually have this kind of two parts to this. So you were writing about, as you mentioned, and you said the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting was the original impetus, right? So you're writing about America's gun violence problem, in particular mass shootings. So two parts to this. The first one is, do you think that writers and artists have a responsibility to address those kinds of things? And the second part is maybe a little bit trickier, and that is how, this is a work of fiction, right? And so people want to be lost in a story, but they don't usually want to receive a lesson through it, right? So how do you do that without being didactic or preachy or something like that? So so I guess the first part is, what's a writer's or artist's responsibility? And the other part is, how do you do that without coming across like you're beating somebody over the head?
Yeah, I'll answer the second part first, because I've gotten a lot of email from folks saying, I really enjoyed the book. It was a good read. You write well, but I don't like the politics. That type of thing. And I didn't want to make this a polemic on gun violence. I really didn't. I grew up in Eastern Oregon, where we had the first day of hunting season off in the high school I attended. People were shooting deer and using the food, right, all year long. They were literally harvesting deer for food. And so we grew up in that kind of culture. My answer to that is, I wanted to write a revenge story, and I wanted it to be from the perspective of what would a father do if a father lost his son to a school shooting, and then it fractured the family to the point where he lost his wife to suicide. What could that person do? And so I didn't want to get too much on the soapbox. I did want to write a revenge thriller. In terms of the responsibility that an author or an artist has, I do think that you want to stay timely. I do think that you want to reflect the culture that you're in. And right now we're in a culture where these things are happening. They're in the news too frequently. They were in the news last week.
Yeah.
And so I do feel not a responsibility, because I am also writing, horror stories about haunted filing cabinets, right? So not a responsibility. And I'm a paperback writer.
So you're anti-filing cabinet stance.
My wife likes to thrift, and she brought home a filing cabinet that is just it's amazing. I'm really happy that she got it. It's a scary piece of furniture, is what I'll say. it had all this old stuff in it, and I don't really want to go to IKEA and build furniture, but I also like buying new things. And so all this old stuff was in there, and I thought, goodness gracious, we need to get rid of this. But it's a haunted filing cabinet, so I'm writing a story about it. So, but I'm a paperback writer. I don't aspire to be anything more than that. I don't think that that I have a responsibility politically to adopt a certain stance on things, but I'm awake to what's going on.
I want to ask you about that. You just called yourself a paperback writer. Do you know this book, Grady Hendrix' book, Paperbacks from Hell?
Yes,
Do you know this
I have
book?
that.
I have it too. I absolutely love this book. And if you don't know it, I'm sure the library has it. So I'm sure Gabriella would like for me to say that.
Oh, yeah.
But it's I mean, I grew up reading paperbacks that were older than me, horror classics and science fiction a little bit, but mostly horror stuff. And reading Grady Hendrix's Paperbacks from Hell just took a deep, real and fun dive into all of that stuff. What does that mean, paperback writer? And is I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. What? Tell us what you mean by that.
So I grew up reading the pulps. I enjoy pulp fiction, and so I'm okay, wasting an afternoon reading asteroid miners from Mars or something like that. It's fine with me. And I do enjoy going to Chamlin and pouring through, all of the old books. A colleague of ours, Michael Haddock, and I read Paperbacks from Hell, and we started swapping those paperbacks back and forth when we found them. Some of them are very rare. So if you ever visit my office at the Deerwood Center, you'd be shocked by my library. It's not Nietzsche. These are science fiction and fantasy books from the 70s in many cases. And so I think the distinction there is to understand, I'm not trying to write the next great American novel. I do want to write stories that cause people to think about the topics, but also just to really enjoy the yarn. I think that's a big part of it, is to enjoy the story.
In this novel, you're dealing with the main character is dealing with some terrible things that happen to the people he loves most in his life, right? You are a husband and a father. I'm curious as to how that affects your writing about those kinds of things.
It was definitely emotional, and it took conversations, with my wife, and thankfully we do walk and talk and have conversations to discuss those things. She read the first chapter, and when I sent it to a couple of trusted readers and a publisher, he said, "You read it well, and I enjoy this, but this is so grim. Like the first chapter is over the top grim," and that was a word he used. And my wife said some of the same things. It features the kind of language that people who are subversive in culture might use, and sometimes you have a question about whether you should do that in your own writing, in terms of truth telling. And it involves violence against children. And so, Stephen King once wrote that violence against animals, he never received as much hate mail as he did when he had a character in the Dead Zone kick a dog to death. And that just completely turned off his audience. I knew that breaking the ice in such a bombastic way was going to be a tough literary choice, but I also felt like that's what the story called for. So, but yeah, so having those conversations with my wife and then internalizing what would I do if I lost my son to something like this.
And a couple things there. So yeah, it's really interesting. I hadn't heard that about Stephen King and the dog situation, but yeah, my wife and I were watching horror movies or something. Why does there always have to be something? If we see a dog, we go, oh no, because it's something like why, but unfortunately, what you're doing here is something that parents have to think about now, and it's absurd, right? I mean, why is everyone not outraged that we should have to worry about that at all? And what kind of country do people want teachers to have to, you know, protect their students and themselves with guns? That seems so backward to me. But I wonder. One of the things that I thought about in reading this was um, the parents of kids whose the kids who were shot in Sandy Hook, and I also know, as if that's not awful enough, that then on top of it you've got people like Alex Jones who stir things up and say it was all fake, and then the parents who lost children have other people sending them hate mail. And some of your characters in here, they weren't, well, I don't know. I don't know where they would be on the Alex Jones spectrum, but
I worried about that.
Yeah.
And some of the feedback I did get was a member of the Sandy Hook Promise, and a person who was with the Sandy Hook Promise read the book and had nice things to say about it. And it's fiction. You're not going to please everybody. And I wasn't trying to write a polemic here. I believe that responsible firearm ownership is 100% something that every American should have. It's just the situation in the schools, as you said. Maybe we're getting apathetic to it as a culture. I know that my daughter did a training this year where they had just a talk with her about what to do with Fletcher in the event of a live shooter. There were 2 instances where it dropped her off at the school, and because of shooting threats, there was a heavy police presence on campus. It was really shocking to see JSO and Duval County law enforcement there. That was twice. But these things happen all over Duval County. It's not just Fletcher. So they're growing up in a different atmosphere than the one that we grew up in. As I said, I grew up in Eastern Oregon in a town called Pendleton, and when I went to school, I graduated from high school in '95. There were gun racks in the back of the trucks in the parking lot at the high school, and at this point in time, that wouldn't be the same way. So, I do think that things have changed very rapidly. It's been a quick change since Columbine.
do you describe yourself as an optimistic person?
I did.
You wake up in the morning and your glass of cold water is half full, you said. How do you maintain that? And how does your writing play any kind of role in that?
Absolutely. I talked with my students the other day about mantras, and mine's read, run, write. When I'm reading a lot, which I consider writing, I consider that if you're reading intentionally, which I have to do to decompress, that counts. When you start talking about the work you do as a writer, reading, writing, and writing help me. And those weeks where I'm hitting those trails and then I'm getting the word processor, those are my singing in the shower weeks. Those are I'm cooking a nice dinner, that type of thing. I feel like my cup's full. And a lot of that optimism comes from working at the college. It's from working with young people, having conversations with young people. So
that's really interesting. I have had times, we both teach at FSCJ. I have had times when my students made me feel really optimistic about things, and sometimes when that's not been the case too. How do your teaching and your writing affect each other?
So they definitely inform each other,
Yeah.
and you have to have a distinction between your nonfiction and your fiction. I wrote a book that was nonfiction a couple years ago, and then I did a project for the college that was all nonfiction. And when you're in that lane, it's hard to switch gears. It's really hard to move back and forth. I've been offered an opportunity to work with Roman and Littlefield on another nonfiction book, and I just don't want to, stray away from the other stuff I'm doing. So, the academic stuff, when I get into a groove on that, I stay in that lane. For the rest of the year, though, I am sitting in my office, writing silly little scary stories that I hope to, publish with Nightmare Magazine or Apex Magazine. And the two are totally different. I can't do them both at the same time. I know that. When I'm writing nonfiction, I'm not writing fiction.
Yeah, interesting. Can you talk about some of your publication success apart from the books? So you mentioned some magazines, and I know you had a story uh, published in one of those Lovecraftian kind of anthologies too, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, I've had a few that were placed into anthologies that feature Lovecraftian themes. But yeah, so the nonfiction, I went to UCF between 2012 and 2017, and my dissertation was picked up by Roman and Littlefield, and it's just an exploration of how we're migrating from the 20th century horror motifs of the spectral haunts into one that's more technological in basis. We're more frightened by the uncanny. We're more frightened by the singularity. We're more frightened by the future of robotics and artificial intelligence. We're getting away from the zombies and the werewolves, and we're moving into the way that we're losing our humanity by sips and swallows, unfortunately. So I fully expect that during my lifetime we'll have sociable robots in the house. I think artificial intelligence and virtual reality, they're already really impacting the way that people communicate and the way that people interact with each other. And so that was really the focus on that nonfiction piece. But I do try to not follow trends. And so when it comes to my writing and it comes to where I'm trying to place things, I never got into looking at what's the hot middle grade, survival dystopian piece, that type of thing. And so if you do kind of look at my bibliography, it bounces around. There's a Western supernatural mythology novel in there. There's a post-apocalyptic thriller set here in Jacksonville. There's a straight-ahead thriller that has no supernatural elements to it. And I think that's a lovely thing, is to be able to, when you chew on a new project, you don't have to be pigeonholed.
So I did want to ask you about this, and you kind of pushed in this direction with what you just said. I think I'd be remiss as both a writer and an educator if I didn't ask you something about AI. I've actually, I try not to be, a Luddite, right? I try not to be reactionary. I try not to just automatically, assume that new technology. I mean, I try and embrace it when it comes, right? I've gone personally kind of in the opposite direction with AI. And a lot of it is because of my students, who I get it. Like, if you are taking a comp class and you hate writing and you can get a program to do a paper for you in 2 minutes, it's going to happen, right? Yeah. But I'm more and more worried about misinformation and disinformation from AI's supposed hallucination, which is just it's making stuff up. And the inability, not to mention Google's, AI overviews that totally obscure. I mean, they mention sources, but most people who look at those things don't look at the sources. They just look at the overview, and that's it. But I think what worries me most is people's inability to tell artificial intelligence, and a lot of times, to me, AI generated writing, if you want to call it that, doesn't even sound human. It sounds uncanny. In fact, it sounds, I don't know. I want to ask questions, and I'm like on a soapbox here. Well, I don't know. And I'm really curious as to. I should have just led with, what do you think about AI?
My next nonfiction piece, which I'm going to work on this year, is going to be about the transactional nature of teaching right now. And it's the diminution of the human condition that we're seeing right now. We're slowly diminishing ourselves through these interactions. They're using a computer program as their own intellectual property, and there's no sincerity, authenticity, or originality to it. And then, because I'm suspicious of it, I don't want to spend 10 minutes writing this extensive feedback.
Right.
And so I'm trading them a rubric after I tell them they got 0 points, because the AI detection tool says that it's 95% computer generated. And that diminishes me because I like giving feedback. I like having conversations with students. I feel like all I'm doing is being robotic. And so the more they do that and the more I do that, the less we're people, the less that we're ourselves. And I think about it the other day. I had 18 really magical years, I thought, as an educator, where there was a lot of good stuff going on, a lot of great interaction back and forth. And then over the last 18 months, we've seen ChatGPT-4, which came out on Christmas 2 years ago. It's completely changed the landscape for intellectual property. People are not creating their own writing. And so I shouldn't say that. That's such a blanket statement that is incorrect. But there's a portion of students who really don't want to create their own intellectual property, and you got to do it under your own steam. That's what I tell them all the time. I feel like now, 18 months later, we're seeing that the wave is receding. That analogy that you just mentioned, in the sense that they're tired of getting balloted 0 points, 0 points, 0 points. We see this as AI. AI definitely has a voice. And now they're writing it again under their own steam. It's probably just like any other plagiarism or course hero or anything else that's out there. There's an 18-month lag time or leeway in there in between, because I'm starting to see good original work again, and a lot of zeros are coming up on the AI detection.
Optimist coming back.
That's the optimist. But honestly, that's the horror, I think, of the future, is that we lose our individuality. If we're all in a place where automation takes our jobs, right? Where AI is doing our work and all we get is a $5,000 check from the government to get through. If we're all just going through the motions, what does that boil down to? And that's what that transactional nature feels like. Here, I'll trade you a 2-minute, you can tell. They'll open up a quiz and 2 minutes later, they're done with it. Complex essay, right? 2 minutes later. I'll trade you a 2-minute ChatGPT essay for your rubric score. And to me, that was never what it was about.
Could you recommend to us some of your own writing, but also maybe some other writing, or even movies or anything else that deal with that kind of diminution of our humanity, and maybe also, I don't know, I'm not asking too much here, something that indicates our humanity reasserting itself would be nice, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
Let me add in several other. I'm just kidding.
Well, so like Alex Garland, I went and saw 28 Years Later yesterday. If you're into the zombie milieu, unbelievable, right? 28 Years Later.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alex Garland, I think, is the best writer/director working, and he made a movie years ago called Ex Machina. Ex Machina's got Domhnall Gleeson in it. It is a harrowing look at the singularity, that moment when technology usurps human ingenuity, really. And it's a scary show, and it's about losing yourself. Which there's other ways that happens, right? It's dementia. It could be Alzheimer's. There's a lot of ways that we lose our identity, or we lose who we are. That's scarier to me than the guy with the hockey mask running through the woods. That's the quiet horror that I kind of like. Ex Machina is a really good example of that. The writers that I think are plumbing this territory to great effect, there's some really good ones out there doing it. Laird Barron has done a really nice job of his short stories. Jeffrey Ford is the most criminally underread writer, I think, in America. He's a professor at a university in Ohio, and everything he writes is great. There's a writer here in town, Will Ludwigson, who teaches at UNF, who does a lot of really fine short stories. I think Joe Lansdale, a Texas writer, his short stories and novels are unbelievable. Those would be a few that I would point to as inspirational and definitely must check out. In terms of an uplifting, this is kind of paradoxical, but every single time I read The Road, and I try to read The Road once a year.
Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It's the best novel I've ever read. Pretty much that and To Have and Have Not by Hemingway are the only books that ever brought tears to my eyes. And in The Road, in the conclusion of The Road, they've been really upholding these human ideals the whole time in the face of terrible things, in the face of cannibalism, in the face of robber bandits on the road. And the kid keeps asking the dad, "Would we ever do that?" And the dad keeps saying, "No, we would never do that. We're not going to go over that hurdle. We're the keepers of the flame." And at the conclusion of the novel, this terrible thing happens, but it's like a generation. They pass the torch to the next generation, and things are going to be okay. That one, despite its sad conclusion, to me feels like there's some hope.
You know what? That's Cormac McCarthy's one of my favorite writers too, and The Road is incredible. And you know what? I used to assign that several years ago, and it's been a while. That might be a really interesting novel to assign in the in response to AI for discussion. Even.
It's 200 pages of the most philosophical and humanistic writing that you'll ever look at.
And though it does end sadly, it does end with hope too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think I sensed Gabriella creeping as she said she was gonna creep. So
I should have come up with an original way, but I was scrambling to get all the books down, so you just get me like slightly walking up. But we are gonna open it up to our audience questions. So if you have any questions, please do write them down. Volunteer will come around and collect. I see we have some. We did get some early birds as well, so I have some to hand off to you already. And I think this one is, especially for you, an inside joke from the man you wanting to.
So I guess the inside joke stays inside.
Yeah.
But,
I have a friend here that plays golf, and we have a little $2 bet, so we might play golf on Tuesday for $2.
all right. So here's a question. When you write a story like down Sawgrass Boneyard and you reference a group like the NRA, how do you balance the fiction side with the nonfiction world?
Great question. You have to fictionalize characters. I had to change the name of the Bohemian Grove, as part of that. I felt like that was important. But there are some entities that are incorporated and integrated in culture that you can definitely comment on and spoof without fear of, legal retribution. They're that large and they're that ingrained. It's, you can say things about the federal government and not worry about reprisal. But I do think, you want to fictionalize the characterization and be cautious. But that is an excellent question. There's a fine line, I feel like, between satirizing and then making it realistic or serve the story. You want it to still serve the story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put that. I think of frames, like when stories pull me out of the frame, sometimes I resent it. Like, you took me out, What is your favorite Stephen King novel?
So many good ones. And they're all, if you go see the library in my office, I've ranked them by order of preference.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So you were ready. You should be ready for this question.
Well, I've got a couple at the top right now. So 11/22/63 is fantastic. But Nightmares and Dreamscapes is the Stephen King book that I will never not read once a year. Nightmares and Dreamscapes is that's like writing 101 for me. And so, but yeah, he's written so many amazing things, like The Gunslinger, the original, the first in the series, which to me was the greatest adventure I ever had reading. I was on the way to Portland with my wife, and I realized after reading all those books to the end, I had 30 pages left, and I didn't want to do it on the plane. I wanted to do it someplace special. So I went to the emergency literature and saved that for a trip that we took to Cedar Key to finish that book, because I'd spent 20 years with it. It's the same way I'm going to feel with The Winds of Winter when George R.R. Martin finally publishes, right? I read all those books over the course of years and years and years. I spent so much time with all those characters, I didn't want to finish it on a plane. But yeah, The Gunslinger is the best adventure I've ever had reading, even more so than The Lord of the Rings.
Quite a statement. How does what genre you're writing in affect your process, if at all? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think I write very quickly when it comes to horror stories. Science fiction and fantasy, less so. I'm imposter syndrome when it comes to those areas, but because I don't know a ton about those fields, I don't read as frequently as I do in horror. But horror, I can sit down and knock out a short story in an afternoon if I have a really good thread and I have a good idea on it. So it does play a role. It seems to me like science fiction and fantasy take a little bit more time.
Okay. So this says, thank you for sharing your time as a newcomer to JAX. Can you recommend local writing groups or continuing education courses or similar for non-degree seeking aspiring writers?
I can definitely recommend the programs that Jacksonville Public Library is instilling now, and we appreciate the opportunity. Thank you all for being here today, by the way. This doesn't happen unless we get a chance to meet and talk book culture. At FSCJ, there are writing clubs that you don't have to be a student to attend to. And if you reached out to me at dpowell@fscj.edu, I might be able to put you into contact with some of those, but you don't have to be a student to participate in those writing clubs.
I'd also like to recommend, actually, there is a bookstore that's about 2 years old and close to where I live. It's called Happy Medium. It's at Park and King. They have stuff going on just about every day of the week. A friend and I host something called Second Sundays with Poets and Writers. So there's actually a really strong writing community in this town. So let's see. So next question says, have you ever started out with an idea, got halfway through, and somehow got turned around? Do you find in your writing that you have a particular character you end up disliking or liking? So two questions, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, some of those don't actually come to fruition. There's a lot of times the thread goes away, and you don't finish the story. But yeah, I've had moments where I've written characters that I thought were going to end up being shown in a certain light that did things. To go back to Flannery O'Connor, in A Good Man Is Hard to Find. There's this door-to-door kind of preacher who has a liaison with a young lady, and he steals her wooden leg. And when they asked Flannery O'Connor, why did they take the leg? She goes, I don't know. She goes, I didn't know until I wrote that down that it was going to happen that way. And I feel like sometimes you'll have a character who does end up surprising you in your own writing. And when that happens, often that's a delightful thing. That's a good thing. You've created something that maybe is subversive, and that's okay.
It takes on its own life. They take on their own lives,
sure.
Right? Yeah. Okay, let's see. What do we have next? How much, I love this question. How much does place play into your writing or the story?
I think it's everything. I think that's mise en scène, that French term for ambiance and atmosphere in a movie. And I think it's everything. I mean, characterization's king. And my best advice to writers is always to create conflict that's authentic and sincere between characters that find themselves in tough spots. That's going to keep people turning the pages. But you do have to imbue every piece of writing with its own sense of mise en scène. And I couldn't write in Florida for many, many years. Like everything I wrote was set in Oregon. Yeah, I spent my whole life there, from elementary school through graduate school. And now I feel much more comfortable. I feel like I can write about at least Northeast Florida from a place of authenticity.
Well, I mean, there's reading this novel immerses you in the Everglades a good bit. So, yeah. I think this is the last question we have here, unless there are any more coming. When do you know an idea is enough for a novel versus short fiction?
Oh, it's another good question. I think again, you have to think about the scope of your canvas, and some stories are meant to be told big and bold. And some stories, especially ones that engage with, I think, timely ideas, important ideas, they need a bigger canvas. And obviously, it's the number of characters that you're putting in the conversation with each other that comes down to that planning we discussed. But the size of the idea and then the kind of the emotional gravitas is going to dictate the size of the story. A lot of times when I'm writing these kind of, Dime Storm magazine horror stories, you can't really develop a character. You can't show a lot of layers of complexity. But if the story's, if the idea is one that's that has some gravitas to it, then you're probably looking at a longer work. And I think one thing that should be said here is that it's totally okay to write a novella It's like some people don't write the 90 to 100 page story anymore, and that is a great canvas. That is a wonderful sweet spot. I've got a collection of 4 novellas in a book called Maximum Dark, and it gets a lot of really good positive reviews because people love that. They can sit down for 2.5 hours and they can immerse themselves in a story, but they don't have to spend a week knocking out that novel. So, but sometimes I feel like you have to tell people, feel free. I mean, the novella is a great length.
That's interesting, actually. Yeah, I've encountered that resistance to novellas too, and it seems like it makes more sense than ever because there is so much. Even those of us who are immersive readers, we've got all kinds of things pulling at our time, and I still love to tackle an 800-page novel by my favorite writer, but a novella is almost kind of perfect in time. I want to follow up on this actually. Have you ever had you ever started out with a story that ended up developing itself more fully into a longer piece, or on the other hand, have you ever started off with something you thought was going to be a novel, and then you got a certain way through and it told you this is all there is?
Yes, I've gone from novel to novella. I've never really gone from short story to much beyond that. I think when you start to, one thing I will say is if you want to write commercial fiction, you should go to the submissiongrinder.com, and you should every day kind of like check the recently added markets. You're going to see magazines and journals show up in there, and I think one of the best pieces of advice I give to folks who are just starting out with writing is to get 4 or 5 stories in circulation on a carousel out there. And if a rejection comes in, try again. And that submission grinder is great because once you start writing to specific markets, like Art and Institutions was that Lovecraftian anthology, you can internalize the ethos of the anthology. It focuses you into to your writing task. And that'll speed things up. You'll get more work done.
Internalize the ethos of the anthology. That's just smoothly, but I don't know, a perfect sounding phrase. Are there any other questions from anybody?
Or for Dr. Gilmore. Dr. Gilmore is a very prolific writer here in Jacksonville and the kind of historian emeritus of our city.
Well, yes.
I'm probably one of your older people here. So I'm interested in what kind of authors you include in your classes. When I was in college, Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, and my husband's a big Isaac Asimov fan, and Robert Heinlein. I grew up reading G.K. Chesterton.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Father Brown. So I'm a mystery fan, but I've gotten diverted into liking what my husband does too.
So my reading list, it consists of a lot of classical authors. We read Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's a great horror writer. We read Shirley Jackson, Ray Bradbury. We read Hemingway and Tim O'Brien. We read a lot of contemporary writers. Charles Yu, who wrote Westworld for HBO. We read Laird Barron. We read Ken Liu, who's an award-winning Chinese writer. But a lot of the stuff that I like, I taught a class last year on the philosophy of horror, and in that class it was a lot of 20th century, mid 20th century writers, really plumbing the depths of the uncanny.
Well, probably the thing that I have assigned more than any other text is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And, I started actually to kind of pull away from it just because I had assigned it so many times over the years. And then some of the pressures that we have had about staying away from teaching anything that has to do with race or anything else made me decide to keep it. So, but also, I've used Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castles, one of my favorite novels. Cormac McCarthy. It's been some time. Years ago, I taught a ghost stories class actually, and we read Beloved, and we read The Turn of the Screw, and God, it's been quite a while. But I used to do those FSCJ calls them themes and types classes. And I did one. It was literature of the living dead, actually. And mostly these days it's 1102. So
If I can recommend a collection, Natural History of Hell by Jeffrey Ford, there's not a bad story in it. And he's a wordsmith.
great title.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful